Good afternoon, Hofstra.
Afternoon.
I didn't hear anything. Good afternoon, Hofstra.
Good afternoon.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to know if someone's there. My name is Dr. Jonathan Lightfoot. I am the director of the Hofstra Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice. I, along with the associate director, Dr. Veronica Lippincott, welcome you to today's Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice last conversation session of the spring 21 semester. Over the last year, we have come to appreciate the many benefits of virtual meeting spaces like Zoom. However, we missed the opportunity to assemble in person on campus and missed the more intimate setting of our physical center located in 203 Roosevelt Hall. We trust the same rich dialogue and community we've come to expect from our pre-COVID events and meetings will not be lost during these virtual sessions. There is light at the end of the COVID-19 tunnel when we will gladly adjust to a new normal of meeting in person again. In the Conversation at the Center for Race is a featured program of roundtable discussions around everyday issues that involve race, culture, and social justice that directly impact the Hofstra community. The aim is to create a space for conversation and to bridge the gap between staff, students, faculty, and administrators of all ranks, giving an equal voice to everyone. In the Conversation at the Center for Race will take place 3 times per semester during Common Hour on the second Wednesday of the month. Please visit our website for more information. Come down here for a second. So, backed by popular demand, we welcome again In the Conversation about Disability Justice, facilitated by Dr. Craig Rusticki and Andrea Nerlich from the Rehabilitation Counseling Programs, and Dr. Craig is from the English and Disability Studies, both at Hofstra. Disability justice has emerged from the disability rights movement and disability studies to address ableism from an intersectional perspective, recognizing that disability relates to other forms of oppression and identity. These marginalized identities are influenced by systems that deny autonomy, dignity, and positive quality of life. With us today to discuss decarcerating disability, improving health, equity, and valuing life with disability are disability justice activists Anita Cameron, Liat Ben-Mwashi, and Dustin Gibson. This event is co-sponsored by the Disability Studies Program and the Rehabilitation Counseling Programs. This event is part of the National Public Health Week and has been pre-approved for 1 credit continuing education unit by the Commission on Rehabilitation Counselor Certification. ASL interpretation and live captioning is available. All center events are free and open to the public. Dr. Lippincott will now share with us a few housekeeping procedures for today's session. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce the facilitators for our event today. Dr. Andrea Nerlich is an associate professor and graduate director of the Rehabilitation Counseling Programs at Hofstra University. She teaches courses for students in rehabilitation counseling and mental health counseling related to psychosocial response to disability, assessment, transition services, and career development. She serves on the board of directors of the Vocational Education Evaluation and Work Adjustment Association and the Rehabilitation Counselors and Educators Association, and is the editor of both associations' journals. She was recently recognized at Rehabilitation Educator of the Year by the National Council on Rehabilitation Education in 2007, and was inducted into the inaugural 40 Under 40 class at her alma mater, Springfield College. Her passions and research interests include transition services for students with disabilities, ecological assessment and vocational evaluation, collaboration models, social justice and advocacy, and student and professional development and identity. Our second facilitator today is Dr. Craig Rusticki. He is a professor of English and director of disabilities studies at Hofstra University. Trained as a literary scholar, he has published on early modern British literature, including a book on the Pope Joan legend concerning a medieval woman who allegedly cross-dressed her way to the papacy. In recent years, Dr. Rusticki, who is legally blind from birth, has begun teaching and writing on disability studies. His current projects concern ocular centrism in H.G. Wells' short story, The Country of the Blind, and the rule of normalcy in Kurt Vonnegut's dystopian tale, Harrison Bergeron. It is my pleasure to introduce our facilitators and speakers for this day's programming. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica and Jonathan. Thanks for joining us for our continuing conversation on disability. In the fall, we focused on the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Today, we're discussing the topic of disability in the context of public health and societal action. Public health uses a lens of the social determinants of health, which are the environments and conditions where people live, learn, work, and play that affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes. These include safe and accessible housing and transportation, education and job opportunities, access to food and physical activity, exposure to racism, discrimination, and violence, and experiences with poverty, incarceration, and institutionalization. Today, we will focus discussion on the disability justice movement with our tremendous speakers to emphasize solutions to health disparities and challenge negative perceptions of the disability experience, especially at the intersection of other identities. First, a couple of housekeeping items. Please remain on mute throughout the presentations. And if you have any questions or comments, they can be added to the chat at any time, but we will address them at the end. If you are a student attending and need to have your attendance noted for a class or for extra credit, 10 minutes before the conclusion of the session, I will place a link to a Google form to complete to make sure that that attendance is noted. If you are a professional rehabilitation counselor and are seeking continuing education credits for your attendance today, I will again put a link in the chat with 5 minutes remaining. But enough about me and my talking. Allow me to please introduce our three panelists for today. Anita Cameron, she, her, hers, has been Not Dead Yet's Director of Minority Outreach since 2017. She has met with national and state policymakers and was published in the National Council on Disabilities report on the dangers of assisted suicide as public policy. As a Black disabled lesbian, Anita used her experience of discrimination to promote understanding among groups of disenfranchised people in terms of social justice. In this realm, she worked with the LGBTQIA2S+ community, which included organizing the first Pride March in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and serving as a national representative to the 1993 March on Washington. She also serves on the NDLA's steering committee and its racism task force. Anita is credited with forming the first Community Emergency Response, or CERT class, consisting of disabled people, becoming the first blind CERT instructor for Colorado, later serving as a radio communications operator during the Colorado flood of 2013, and assisting survivors of Hurricanes Irma and Harvey in disaster relief. As an advocate and activist, she's been arrested 139 times for civil disobedience as an ADAPT member, invited to the White House on 2 occasions, and helped to organize a national march. Anita has been honored with multiple awards, including the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network Service to the Self-Advocacy Movement Award, the Lead On Award for her work with ADAPT, and inclusion in the Rochester Museum of Science Center exhibit, Rochester Women Changing the World. Dr. Liat Ben-Moshe is an assistant professor of criminology, law, and justice at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She has a PhD in sociology with concentrations in women and gender studies and disability studies from Syracuse University. Over the last decade, her work has brought an intersectional disability studies approach to the phenomenon of mass incarceration and decarceration in the US, focusing activism around criminal justice reform and prison abolition. Liat has presented over 30 workshops and keynote speeches since 2014 on topics such as politics of abolition and disability madness, disability, mental health and imprisonment, deinstitutionalization and community living, disability culture, anti-psychiatry and mad pride, racial formations of disability madness and empire, carceral ableism and feminist abolition, inclusive pedagogy and universal instructional design, and disability in higher education and the limits of diversity and inclusion. Her work has centered on showing that disability and mental differences are not only medical conditions, but the basis of social movements and cultures with deep histories of oppression and resistance. Noted works and collaborations include Disability Incarcerated, Imprisonment and Disability in the US and Canada in 2014, and Decarcerating Disability, Deinstitutionalization in Prison Abolition in 2020. Her scholarly work has garnered awards such as the President's Outstanding New Scholar Award by Western Social Science Association in 2016, and an American Association of University Women Fellowship for 2017-2018. Dustin Gibson has worked with all three Centers for Independent Living in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania region, and has held positions with both of the national independent living organizations. His work has been to end the institutionalization and incarceration of disabled people in particular, and support them to live in the community with dignity of risk. Dustin is the Access, Disability, and Language Justice Coordinator at People's Hub, an online movement school, a peer support trainer with Disability Link, home of Georgia's peer support program for formerly institutionalized people, a board member with Straight Ahead, an organization working to end death by incarceration in Pennsylvania, a founding member of Us Protecting Us, a collective training community to handle crisis without police in Atlanta, Georgia, and an organizer with the Policing and Allegheny County Committee, a collective focused on decarcerating the county jail and ending policing in Southwest Pennsylvania. I would now turn the conversation over to my partner, Craig Rustiki, for his conversation with our panelists.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank everyone who's contributed to our session. We will try to get through 3 to 4 questions, and so we'll be asking each of the panelists to try to limit their response to each question to about 5 minutes. So disability justice is an evolution or perhaps a revolution in the disability community, and our panelists belong to a range of communities or identities that include, but are not limited to, people with disabilities. So I'd like to ask each, what is disability justice as a movement, and what does it mean to you and the people who share your identities? And in this case, I think I'll ask Anita to start, Dustin to follow, and Liat, since she merges both activism and academics, to maybe try to wrap up this definitional question. Thank you.
Hi, this is Anita. Disability justice is a movement. I feel that it's imperative that disability justice is it's sometimes people use it interchangeably with disability rights, but it's more than that. And so disability justice to me, is all about seeing and working, on things from an intersectionality perspective, that the people who are, as Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley once said, the people who are closest to the pain, should be in the leadership. So people who are most affected, by things being in leadership, being interdependent, because we tend to, I think, overvalue independence. Whereas if we're working together, and depending, it takes all of us working together and interconnectedly, to affect disability justice. And so those are the 3 main things that it means to me, and kind of what the disability justice movement overall means to me. Thanks.
Thank you, Anita. Dustin, how about you?
Hey, this is Dustin. I want to start off by saying Ramadan Mubarak to people that are observing right now. Also, I'm a light-skinned Black person. I have a beard. I have a fro behind me. I have books. I also have a black hoodie on that says "Free the People" at the top of it. And also my sign name is DG, just D by the side of my head and then G under my beard, across my chest. So I guess like I want to respond to the question, but I also want to just like note that I don't think that in its current form that we actually have a movement for disability justice. I think that we have foundational pieces. I think we have an opportunity to build the movement, but as it is right now, I don't think it's an actual movement that we can struggle in at the moment. Also want to recognize that it does have a lineage too. So I don't think that disability justice is just something that is a tentacle of disability rights or it's grown out of disability rights movements. But I'm also thinking about other movements that have informed the way that disability justice operates as a framework right now. And it's important to note that it is something that has been given to us by colonized people, by Black people, queer folks, trans folks, which is diametrically opposed to the traditional disability rights movement that we typically acknowledge. It's also important to note that the disability rights movement has a lineage in Black freedom movements as well. And some of the frameworks in which they organized off of to start movements like the independent living movement were taken from the US Black South and organizers at that point. So I'm thinking about people like Ella Baker. I'm thinking about people like Fannie Lou Hamer that inspired disability rights movements. And what it means to, I guess, myself as a disabled person, but also somebody that is of a Black community and also of a generation of hip hop. It has the opportunity to articulate our experiences in a way that disability rights hasn't done. A lot of the work has been state facing, at least that I've been exposed to in the last 20 to 30 years. So disability justice is something that has the ability to be in and of community in a different way. So to acknowledge the way in which like we utilize language and what language we use, thinking specifically about Black people as being people that have talked about disability forever because we've had disabilities forever, but haven't used the language, the Western language of disability. So then we get projects that are like really born in disability rights that are focused on how do we access services that are set up for disabled people, right? And there's a bunch of cultural barriers that influence who gets those services, who is viewed as disabled. And I don't necessarily view that as like the most important thing to being able to access the response to what we're experiencing because of ableism. The last thing I'll mention, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about this, that I think disability justice has the potential to be something that's an internationalist movement. There have been formations of disability rights that is international, that doesn't center the United States or the empire in what we want to do, but disability rights and disability justice in the US is at times running counter to what other folks outside of the US, particularly the global South, are looking to do to advance their quality of life as disabled people. So I think because there's a focus on language justice as a part of disability justice, that we have the ability to communicate in a way that we haven't seen with disability related and led movements.
Thank you, Dustin. Liat?
Thank you. So I want to really build on what Dustin was just saying and what Anita was saying. And I put in the chat some of the principles of disability justice as constructed by Sins Invalid, which is a disability kind of arts and culture group in the Bay Area, but was built in community. It's exactly the communities that Dustin was just talking about. Before I answer the question though, I just want to self-describe myself for people who can't see. So I'm a kind of a pale skin, white femme person wearing a lipstick and glasses, and I'm wearing earrings today. that say gladiolas, not cages. And behind me is a zoom background of the cover of my book, Decarcerating Disability, which is concentric circles that kind of explode at the end of them. And so I want to answer, also I'm physically disabled. You can't see it because of the Zoom background, but I think it's important to note. In the outside world, it's very visible. So I want to build on this answer and especially focus on the first principle that both Anita and Dustin mentioned, which is intersectionality, and talk for a moment what that means and what that means to me. And so intersectionality, I think some people take it to mean how our identities are connected to each other. And I do think there are streams in intersectionality that think like that. But intersectionality, if we take the definition of Kimberly Crenshaw, which a lot of people do, and I'm sorry, Crenshaw is C-R-E-N-S-H-A-W, Kimberly Crenshaw. Her definition of intersectionality, she says, it's a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides. So it's a relationship to power and to structures of oppression. It's not a relationship between identities. And so the reason why I'm saying that is because some people kind of take that framework of disability justice or intersectionality to say, okay, I'm white and Jewish, which I am. And then to say, therefore I'm, oppressed and also not oppressed in various ways. Somebody has their mic on. It's making noise. Thank you. And I think it's more important to look at it as a relationship in how we view how power circulates. And what I mean by this is that it's a framework that relates our experiences to structures of oppression. And particularly, of course, it came from Black feminism. And I think that it's really important to anchor disability justice there as well in the wisdom of people of color, queer people, gender nonconforming, people who were institutionalized, and so on and so on, which is very much connected to another principle, which is, leadership by people who are most affected. So I can talk for just a moment about how I came to this work. And I came to it through how Justin ended. I'm not from the US, and I actually came to do disability work as a disabled person through a kind of disability rights framework, which was pretty nationalistic, as it is in the US as well. But at the same time, I also did anti-occupation activism against the occupation in Palestine. And I did that in Israel and in the Middle East. And I got politicized really through that. So I got politicized through, revolutionary, radical kind of framework that were about the liberation of people from occupation. And I think it's important to say that in this context, because I think that disability justice is also a revolutionary framework. And I think it's important to kind of understand it as such. It's a framework that's it's not just about, peace and prosperity and quality of life. It's about changing how structures are organized in the US, including imperialism and capitalism and white supremacy and so on.
Thank you so much, all three. The next question I'd like to pose is, from your own work and perspective, what are some of the greatest systemic barriers to disability justice and equity? And if I may, I'll just sort of reverse the order this time, ask Liat to start, then Dustin, and for Anita to finish up this question.
Sure. So that's a really, really important question. I'm just going to kind of talk about what I think is some of the biggest systemic barriers. So the barriers, of course, are not barriers in our bodies and minds. I mean, people who have any kind of disability studies understanding know this. The barriers are structural, like I was just saying. I focus particularly around the structural barriers that are posed by incarceration. And by incarceration, I mean both in prisons and jails, as well as other sites of disability confinement, for example, nursing homes, psychiatric hospitals, and institutions for people with intellectual or developmental disability labels. So first, I want to say that one of the barriers is that we don't fully understand institutionalization as a form of confinement. And our policy looks like that, the way we react to people who are institutionalized or incarceration looks like that, and so on. So we don't necessarily, especially people who are here, who are not from the disability community, who might be doing anti-prison work, for example. It's really important to understand that nursing homes, for example, psychiatric hospitals are sites of incarceration. If people here are doing anything from prison reform to abolition, I think it's really important to also understand that those are sites of incarceration. And unless we liberate everybody, we haven't done our job. I want to also say to people who do disability work, but don't know much about incarceration, that prisons are sites of debilitation, and they are disabling, they are maddening, and they are meant to do that, right? They are, I'm using the word debilitation, which comes from the work of Jasbir Puar, P-U-A-R. And what she means by debilitation is a form of state violence. It's the targeting people to wear them down. It's slow death on a population level. And so this form of debilitation that's done through incarceration is incredibly connected, of course, to ableism and to white supremacy and to gender and sexuality and so on. And I think we need to understand it as such. So people here on this webinar today that do disability work, it's really important to look at incarceration as a huge barrier to the equity and justice of people with disability. And the last thing I would say, I really, really like this quote from Judy Chamberlain, who's Chamberlain is Chamberlin, and Judy is it's Judi. So she's a late mad anti-psychiatry and disability activist. And she got really fed up with this idea that mental illness is like any other illness, and that what we need to fight is the stigma of people with disabilities. And this is a quote from her, and she said, given involuntary hospitalization, mental difference should not be characterized as an illness, but as a consequence of a system of power and inequality that denies people their basic freedom and basic needs. So what she's saying is that it's not stigma we need to fight, it's psychiatry as a form of oppression. And I think that's true to a lot of disabled people's lives, both people who are mad and maybe not anti-psychiatry at all. But I think these systems kind of seep into our lives and suck things out of our lives. So it's really important to kind of think systematically. And to me, that system is a system of confinement, of incarceration, of psychiatrization, of biologizing our lives more generally, of pathologizing our lives more generally. These are the barriers that I'm currently involved to fight against.
Thank you, Liat. Dustin, could you speak to the same question about systemic barriers?
Yeah, this is Dustin, and as building off of what Liat just mentioned, I'm thinking also about, well, one, like the broader like projects of colonialism and capitalism and imperialism being like some of the sources of the barriers that exist, but then also looking at the carceral sites or any of the sites of confinement in which people are held. Now I think in disability communities, we say like you're in an institution if you can't, you know, get a burrito at 3 a.m. But traditionally, institutions are these places that we would think of as being self-sustaining, oftentimes having like some of the same style or visual aesthetics, fences like grassy knolls, water towers. So very much like prisons, and a lot of the prisons used to be either asylums or state hospitals or what have you, and vice versa as well. So there's this inextricable link between those sites of confinement. And I mentioned that as a systemic barrier because I'm thinking about all of the other harms that they cause. And because we have that as an option, we don't have investments in supports that we actually need. So taken from people like Dr. Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who talks about abolition as a project of presence rather than absence. And in order for abolition to happen, we have to change one thing, and that thing is everything. So thinking about a reorientation of society with a project of abolition that doesn't have these sites of confinement, and people like Anita, who is like a large part of the reason that I know what I know about institutions, even while I was in institutions, thinking about their work to get people out. It's largely like articulating like this institutional bias that exists within an uncare system. And I say uncare because I believe that there's an intention to keep people in a perpetual state of dependency upon the state for basic necessities, whether it's housing, food, cash assistance, all of the things that actually don't promote the self-determination of disabled people. So that institutional bias traffics people into all forms of institution and doesn't allow for the things that we actually need to be rooted in our home, in our communities. And the institutions themselves are purveyors of violence, right? Like the actual structural build of it. Like I'm thinking about people like right now, Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is a political prisoner in Pennsylvania. He's been incarcerated for almost 40 years or more than 40 years, had Hep C, had to litigate a case in order to get treatment for Hep C, which they were successful in doing, and then also getting that medication for a lot of other prisoners, which was literally life-saving. But because of the prison, the structural build, the uncare that exists, he's dealing with congestive heart failure. He's dealing with liver cirrhosis right now. So there's all of these other impacts that you have. And anybody that knows anything about prisons, you know, if you're there for long enough, you will get a disability. They also do things like contaminate the water, or they're built a lot of times on Superfund sites. I think there's like 600 federal prisons on Superfund sites, like places that are literally wastelands or deadlands. And that water is not just contaminated for people that are in the prison or the total institution, but it's also for communities that are adjacent to it. So to think about these is sites of like, okay, they're impacting the people in prison. In the pandemic, we've seen this like in a really hyper visible way. Thinking about over 50% of the deaths of COVID in the US are directly related to either people in nursing facilities or people that go in and out of nursing facilities. So we know that these are not actually adequate to promote health and wellness. So the question is like, what do we do instead of that? So I would caution against like the framing of an alternative to prisons, an alternative to institutions. Because what we've learned as a part of the deinstitutionalization movement is that it doesn't have to be that traditional water tower, a large building that holds 5,000 people. We can have institutions that exist within community that look like homes, that look like apartments, that sometimes look like service providers, but carry the institutional and carceral logics. So that's what we're attempting to like get rid of and weed out. So I'll just quote one more person. Mariam Kaba talks about policing in the sense of we have to get rid of the cops in our head. And there's a lot of learnings from the deinstitutionalization movement that address like bias that is not only held within systems, but within people that are purportedly there to support disabled folks. So thinking about like how we just like view disability, one, as a bad thing, view disabled people to be through a lens of pity, that being an important thing to like work through and undo. So we know that the solution sometimes is literally just nothing. Like when we're like, what do people need? Like it's like, instead of a jail, they need to be in a mental health institution or some other form or fashion. And a lot of the times, like, people just need to be left the fuck alone, to be honest. And it's just like, they don't need anything, right? Outside of like those basic necessities, the housing and the food. And I think a lot of the problems that exacerbate disability and create a bad quality of life for some of us are not disability related. It's about ableism, and it's about the other things that are making life with disability a hard one.
Thank you, Dustin. Anita, could you also speak to this question of systemic barriers to disability justice and equity?
Sure. And before I do that, let me give a brief visual description of me. I'm a Black woman, kind of caramel skin color, long locks, and I'm wearing a gray shirt that says Black Lives Matter, and the letters are made up of the names of all the Black people who have been murdered or brutalized by police. And my sign name is A down the side of my face, signifying my long hair. Wow, systemic barriers to the ableism, for one, that institutional bias that Dustin has spoken so eloquently about, whether it's nursing homes, whether it's prisons and jails, and the fact that because of the systems around it, if you're not careful, your own home can wind up being an institution because of the medical model systems that you may have in place for support. So say, for instance, if you need attendant services or different types of supports, and you have to deal with that or receive those on their terms, not yours, then you find yourself, oftentimes you're stuck in a house waiting for them, or you have to do what they want, or else, you kind of get kicked out. Ableism and this kind of societal thought that it's better to be dead than disabled, and that in certainly in the terms of my work, that factors into why a lot of folks are into this whole doctor-assisted suicide, and it ends up affecting people with disabilities. It's not a matter of terminal illness, really, according to the data. It's a matter of disability, and disability issues and concerns that haven't been effectively addressed. Like your loss of autonomy, or feelings of being a burden, or dealing with the loss of activities, being able to do certain activities, things of that nature. It's how people see us, that they want us, it's almost like lock them away so we don't have to see them, kind of thing, that discomfort, that why aren't you somewhere being cared for when institutions do not care for you? They are not built to care for you. They are not meant to care for you. People say, and I've been institutionalized both in psychiatric facilities and in nursing homes. And neither are places, for that promote any kind of freedom. It's that whole policing, if you will, of your life and everything you do, as a person with disabilities. I see systemic and institutional racism and white supremacy as barriers to care. I see this whole thought that you have to have some type of quality of life, if you will, to get what you need. And if you don't have that quality of life or perceived quality of life, then you are undeserving, of the things that keep you free and independent, and healthy. I think a lot about Michael Hickson and the decision to withhold treatment for COVID-19 that he got in a nursing home, and then because of his disability, the doctors saying, withholding his treatment and allowing him to die. And how many more Michael Hicksons are there out there? I think about how COVID-19 has ravaged communities of color, particularly like the Black community, indigenous communities, to the point where you have whole tribes gone, languages gone, forever, because of our system and the way that things are set up, and that are biased, in that the government is just it's certainly not a solution. And I think as Dustin stated earlier, sometimes the solution is just leave people alone and let people be, and let people do what they need to do, and stop looking at things that we may do as dangerous, if you will, or threatening. And so there's a whole, to me, uh, there's a plethora of attitudes and that contribute to those of us with disabilities not being able to access the things that we need. And hey, I'm gonna come on out and say, homophobia, transphobia, all these, it plays its part in people not being, able to get, the things that we need, to keep us, to keep and make us whole. The lack of housing, lack of, certainly lack of affordable housing, transportation, a lot of our communities, marginalized communities, being built, like some of these prisons on these Superfund sites, and on these places where like there are factories belching all kinds of stuff into the air, that causes cancer and other disabilities. I think sometimes poverty and the living in and existing in poverty is disabling and can cause disability. So many, so many things that, for some, it's almost like, yeah, what can you do? And for some, it's a change, a real sea change in the attitudes that people have towards us. It's so yeah. I'm gonna stop there because I can go on and on.
Well, actually, the conversation that's already begun about solutions really leads us to the next question, and which is sort of where to focus. What should be the focus of advocacy, activism, concern, and compassion toward realizing better outcomes? And if I'll just, since you could go on, Anita, I'll ask you to start, and then Liat, and then we'll finish with Dustin on this question.
Solutions focused on people and systems. You know, we we certainly don't need to. For some things, there are no no substitute. Institutional bias, get rid of them. Okay, abolish those those systems, whether it's prisons and jails, nursing homes, group homes, medical model systems that keep that keep us down or that control us. We have to advocate against and tear down systemic and institutional racism, ableism, classism, the all of that, homophobia, transphobia, to kind of, there's, I think that there's so much that it's not one simple answer. I think it's a number of things that have to be done. So I don't think there's one simple answer or one focus on how one can advocate, to it's all. Yeah, I think that our advocacy should be interconnected, with other people, other groups, and all, because how can you fight to get rid of nursing homes when prisons and jails are just as disabling? How can you, how can you get rid of ableism without getting rid of, tearing down, structural racism, because it's intertwined. And so I think that our groups, groups fighting for, it's all about that interconnected. Sometimes I have a problem articulating the words that are in my mind, but it's a matter of us working together and that interconnectedness, because I'm not free unless everybody's free. And disabled people aren't free unless, everybody's free, and we can't, work on systemic racism without dealing with patriarchal stuff and capitalism and how that harms us. So I think, advocates, I think that we need to come together and try to work together interconnectedly on all of this. I don't think, certainly in my experience, that there's one real answer or one real way to focus. on that. You know, it's really all about us being able to put aside differences, get out the silos. A lot of times that our advocacy lands us in, you know, and come together, you know, otherwise, you know, I don't think that we're, you know, we're true advocates.
Thank you, Anita. So, Liat, keeping in mind sort of Anita's bracing response and caution about focus and the need to respect the interconnectedness.
Did I talk and no one heard me?
I certainly heard you.
Oh, okay. I was afraid that I was muted. Okay.
No,
So,
no. So Liat, I'm not going to ask necessarily about focus based on Anita's remarks about, you know, interconnectedness, but maybe what are places to start with advocacy, with activism, given everything that we've already been wrestling with in terms of the interconnectedness and the way it's hard to pull one thread out from the others.
Yeah, that's a great question. And also, thank you so much, Anita. Like, there's very little to say after that because Anita just dropped so many truth bombs here. And it's not just that everything is interconnected. I mean, like Anita was saying, like there's really no point in being kind of like single issue about these like mass like structural problems that we're talking about. But I think the issue of like where to start, I think is important. And I think it's always about like starting locally, starting in community, starting like where you're at. So two things I would say about that. One is, to me, the question of like how to on-ramp people into the struggle is like super important. I think a lot of people understand the critiques, but maybe don't know like how to kind of move forward with it. And trust that there's people around you that are similarly situated. So I'm not going to kind of push people towards, you know, the particular kind of formations or organizations, but, you know, start where you're at. I mean, you're in Hofstra. Does Hofstra have cops on campus? Do the cops have guns? What do you do about that? And there's a huge national movement of getting cops off campus, for example. Mandatory reporting. I know that on, you know, on college campuses, we're all mandatory reporters, right? And what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of our connections to carcerality? And what would it mean to abolish that? What did it mean? And so on and so on. So, you know, you all have to start like where you're at. When Anita is saying we need to abolish basically the medicalizing, pathologizing system that oppress us, you know, if you work in medical settings, this maybe is where you start. So I can't tell people where to start in terms of that, but, you know, kind of look around you, right? And then do it with other people. Nobody has done it, you know, on their own. The second thing I would say is, you know, I spent 10 years writing and working with people around the lessons of deinstitutionalization. So people who are interested, there's a really long book. It's like 300 pages that I wrote about the lessons of deinstitutionalization. But let me just give two in 2 minutes. Let me do it. Okay, so 2 lessons from deinstitutionalization that I think are a good start. One is, people often ask in the prison abolition context and in general, the question of where do we start and who do we start with, right? And what I learned from deinstitutionalization is you start with the people who are most affected and the people that we often think should not be decarcerated. So in deinstitutionalization, it looked like people with very complex medical needs, or people who in the awful medical lingo were called like profoundly disabled and so on. And once you find uh, quality community living ways to deinstitutionalize people or prevent institutionalization of people that live under that label, then it's of course would become very easy then to completely abolish the entire system. Because if we don't need institutionalization for people who are quote unquote profound or severe or whatever the category is, and I'm kind of like reclaiming those words when I'm speaking, these are not negative terms, then it will be much easier to do other things. So I guess what I'm saying in terms of, prison abolition, for example, people always go into, let's decriminalize pot. And of course we need to decriminalize pot. But also let's think about actually people who have done harm, people who, not just the people, but like the conditions of harm, right? Like we need to think about that. And then of course, pot will be legalized because we've already created like a different structure of caring. We already created like a different society. So my first lessons from deinstitutionalization is let's start from there. The second lesson is about the when, the timing, not just how do we start, but when. And my lesson from deinstitutionalization is always now. It's never like wait. So we would have never seen like this massive closure of psych institutions and institutions for people with intellectual and disability labels if people would have waited, and if they would have waited until all the conditions were ripe, exactly what Anita was saying earlier. We need a completely different system of caring, of what community means. And if we wait until that system is set up, people will not be free. And this lesson comes from the people who are institutionalized. For them, this question is ludicrous. What do you mean by waiting? Waiting, for what? And the people who fuel the movements are that, like it's self-advocacy, anti-psychiatry, med movements, disability movements. This is what fueled deinstitutionalization. So these are just my very fast like takeaways. There's 250 more pages of lessons.
Thank you so much, Liat. Dustin, so the same sort of question, I guess, is what are places to start? What are steps to take? And you've obviously been doing this work already.
Yeah, this is Dustin. And if you hear birds chirping or dog barking, that's because I've changed locations to kind of get away from the dog barking, but he follows me. So I just want to I find this question pretty difficult most of the times because what I see as effective is really based on what people's position are, whether that's your socioeconomic status, whether that's your geographical location, and what is happening where you're at. So to think really about what already exists in your communities. Typically, if you're just starting to come into advocacy, activism, any type of world building work, people have already been doing that. So it's to find those people doing that and join some type of organization to have a political home to be rooted in. That is also about the accountability that exists once you're amongst the community. And I view all those to be very important tenets, because when we're talking about building a new world, some of these organizations or these people that we're building that with, we're actually practicing what it looks like to build that world. So as Liat just mentioned, we can't wait for the right time to, abolish prisons, the right time to get people out of nursing facilities. We also have to be acting as if we're doing that in the moment. And in particular, in this moment, I'm thinking about nursing facilities, and we should really be operating from under the pretense that everyone in a nursing facility right now has COVID, and acting accordingly based off of that. So there's places that are doing that right now. Atlantis, which is a Center for Independent Living in Denver. There's another one in North Central Pennsylvania. There's a spot in Chicago where people are relocating people out of nursing facilities, putting them in hotels, and then finding out how to get them into communities after quarantine and building up skills, whether it's using a phone, ordering food, what people would typically refer to as soft skills as well. So those type of projects are really important, and there's like a bunch of ways to plug in, and I'm gonna flood the chat with resources as well. But I wanna just like kind of maybe talk about a few of the things that I'm engaged in, and maybe it gives like folks, it could be a catalyst for other people to do something as similar. At People's Hub, there was a recognition in large part due to Alandria Williams, who's a Black, chronically ill, queer person from the South, born and raised and has a long lineage in the South as well, that became an ancestor last year. But before Alandria passed, we were building out a program around disability justice and access and movement work. With the focus on, our focus at People's Hub is solidarity economy networks. It is dismantling the far right, and it is climate justice. And there was a recognition because of Alandria's lived experience that disabled people get pushed out of movement work for a whole bunch of reasons. Inaccessibility is one of them. So what does it mean for us to not engage with disability related advocacy directly, but go to places where disabled people are at, they're not identifying politically as disabled, and building out supports for them to be able to be held in those spaces, because we know that what they're bringing to it is actually impacting disabled people indirectly, and it's influencing who can go into those spaces and who can influence and shape our movements going forward. So that looks like a bunch of different ways, and you don't have to be a part of a program to do that. You could be the person that is saying like, who is the interpreters at the event? Have the interpreters prepped. Is there an accessible bathroom at this place? Not just like an accessible doorway, but can people actually get to the bathroom once they get in this place? If there's not, can I help fundraise for that? Like, so to think about those ways, and those are just like very basic principles of access. Another is the at Disability Link, I'm a part of a peer support program where transition people out of institutions, so like the asylums and state hospitals, state centers in Pennsylvania, and do train the trainer peer support groups on how to provide peer support to other folks in that same situation. So if you're not somebody that's a peer, you can definitely monetarily support that. You can definitely donate space. You can be the communications and outreach person for that. We are always in need of more people to connect with people in institutions because of communication barriers. So especially if you're in the medical field, you can be that conduit for that, sometimes to just relay information. Straight Ahead, which is the organization born from the Abolitionist Law Center, and Straight Ahead is also taken from the words of Russell Maroon Schultz, who is a political prisoner in Pennsylvania right now, who we're pushing for his compassionate release. He has stage 4 cancer and has been in prison for 40 years as well. But to think about death by incarceration as what Liat said, the people that are seen as like the focal group for the reason for the institution, knowing that if there is a group like that and that's the response, that it'll be built and it'll capture more people. So the folks that are serving death by incarceration sentences are the people that society is generally okay with disposing of because of something that they've purportedly done. So it's really to focus in on that, and then to think about like some of the creative things that are being thought about is like, how do we factor in intellectual disability and sentencing and commutations and pardons? So these are things that we need like active thought on. Like one example was last year, we had a group where for a year we had a think tank essentially, and then we lobbied the Attorney General, we lobbied politicians to incorporate disability in a factor for pardons or parole. And then I'll just mention like a couple of other things, and I'll drop resources in the chat. Us Protecting Us is a group that was born after Anthony Hill was murdered by police in DeKalb County in Georgia. Anthony was somebody with psychiatric disabilities, and I won't go into details of his death, but I can drop something for people that are interested in that. But Us Protecting Us is a group of non-disabled and disabled people that recognize disabled people are at the brunt of policing and the violence in which they perpetuate. So we're thinking about all of the things that we need in order to not have police intervene in anything that we do. So one of those things is a response to crisis, or a response to people that have the potential to be in crisis. And what do we do when the police actually arrive? So that is equipping all of us with those skills in order to handle all of those situations. And that looks like very on the ground, door to door type advocacy and training. And then the last one I'll say is the Policing in Allegheny County Committee, where we really push for decarceration of people in the jail. So a lot of that has to do with like opening lines of communication with people that are in the jail currently or have been in the jail, and then broadcasting that to the wider public, and then providing support on the outside. So mutual aid. When people get out of jail, they need like cell phone chargers and cigarettes and beanies and gloves. So things like that. And there's a bunch of ways to plug into those type of mutual aid efforts, probably wherever you're at. And I'll stop now for like fear of rambling, and I didn't like keep track of time. Yeah.
Thank you. Those have been really powerful answers. I'm going to hand things back to Andrea so that we can look to possible questions from the audience and also some final thoughts.
Awesome, thank you. And I hope everyone else was feverishly writing down names and thoughts and things to look up later. And Dustin, thank you for putting so many things in the chat that I'm going to be saving all of this and being able to pass this along to my students. But one question from one of our members, who's actually a wonderful local rehabilitation counselor. Any suggestions for addressing ableism within the disability community that might be a barrier for advancing social justice, disability justice initiatives? So where do we see ableism within the disability community that can really keep some of the initiatives for disability justice down? And I don't know who wants to.
I
I don't know if you want me to call on one of you like I have to do with my students, but if anyone, any of our three speakers feels that they're well versed to tackle this question.
I can just start with just maybe some examples. I do think it's real, and I appreciate the question. I also think, just like the last question, this is a question better answered in community, right? So it's better to know like what is like the specific context, and then how to approach it as a community, and your relationship to the community that you're trying to kind of tackle ableism with. I would say that it's just to validate, like, this is absolutely a thing that happens. But we often talk about like this like hierarchies of disabilities, and particularly how people who are not speaking use other forms of communication. People with IDD labels, people with psych disabilities are often like at the kind of bottom of the hierarchies. It's very connected, to not to kind of call on Anita, but it's incredibly connected to this kind of like who's worthy of living kind of thing, and very prevalent in various kind of campaigns within disability activism. I have to say that within disability justice, I haven't seen it as much, because disability justice, like I said, is a revolutionary framework. People usually, when they already come to the table with the disability justice understanding, which is a political framework and does take time to get into and understand, but once that's the case, the kind of accountability that needs to happen is usually quite different than completely educating somebody around what is privilege and oppression, and what is ableism, and what is ableism within different communities, because disability justice is a framework that kind of comes already to the table with that. So again, it's very hard to answer that question in a kind of global sense, except that, a lot of it is about political education. Even those of us who identify as disabled didn't necessarily, we weren't politicized like just by being disabled. I wasn't, I can't speak to other people. I learned to be disabled politically by being in community and by having people teach me, and by, you know, reading and learning and understanding of like the history of oppression and resistance that disabled people have. And so I think that that is political education, and that's part of what we need to do to combat it.
Would anyone else like to build on that, either Anita or Dustin?
This is Dustin. I'll just say quickly that I agree with Leah with the political education piece. The lateral ableism does exist, and a part of being in community and attempting to operate from a disability justice framework, which one of the principles does call for cross disability solidarity, is viewing the issues that we're struggling with in a way that like acknowledges that most people that are disabled have multiple disabilities to begin with, and then also how it's outside of ourselves too. So it's not something that's driven solely based on your identity, but it's driven based off of, or we're guided based on how it's actually impacting people. And that has to be rooted in some form of political education. Like study, I believe, should be like very rigorous. And one of the ways we can get rid of ableism though is like the way in which like sometimes we talk about things, or the type of study and education we're doing. Because it's ableist to think that like we can operate as like a traditional public school system in the US with the same like learning styles and somehow be accessible to folks. So I think like through practicing disability justice, it's like providing options to people. Somebody I train with a lot, Linda Pogue, in the peer support training, Linda's always like, peer support is about options and giving people choice. And when we do political education that way, I think it benefits a lot of us.
And
Yes,
Dustin,
Anita.
if you see in the chat, or anyone else, Anita, I did see you came off, so I want to give you a chance to. But if also we can take a look at the question in preparation. But Anita, what are your thoughts on the ableism within?
Well, I think that education is key, and political education as well. But I also, think about that we have to educate people, kind of where they are. I mean, this is like a college setting, and college level stuff, but not everybody has that level of learning, and understanding and all. And we have to meet them where they are and educate them where they are, in terms that they can understand that, hey, maybe what you said or what you did was ableist or racist or whatever, because there are people out there who believe that, hey, I can't be ableist, I'm disabled myself, or I can't be racist because I'm disabled, or so it, to me it's all about educating them where they are, in terms that they can understand, and deal with, and then having that accountability to folks.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. There is a lot of privilege being in these settings and the way that we speak and what we do. As kind of a final thought, a good question that came through about, and Dustin, if you want to kick it off, or anyone else, a correlation between anti-Black racism and ableism, and the idea that when we think of disability and age-related disability, or disability kind of as an open minority group, how can these two things kind of come together in hopes that people can become justice advocates and activists?
Yep, this is Dustin. So I would just say that I don't think those I view ableism as something that is dependent upon anti-Blackness. And I mean, there's like a bunch of historical references, like I would point to Dr. Terry Pickens, who has a book called Mad Blackness. It's some, yeah, it's like it's a confusing title, but I can drop that in the chat too. But thinking about like the pathologization of Blackness, criminalization, disability, thinking about ableism as a construct that creates like a stereotypical or a normal type of person, body and mind, and anything that exists outside of that paradigm to be deviant or deficient. So there's like obvious correlations as to how Blackness sometimes is that, how disability is sometimes is that, how queerness is that, how being somebody that is not a man is that, like, and it captures a lot of people. But I would just say at its core, it's definitely rooted in anti-Blackness. And I can provide some context in the chat.
Any other parting words or thoughts on that from any of our three panelists as we close in the waning 2-3 minutes here with our audience?
I just want to close with, you know, a lot of appreciation for Anita and Dustin's, you know, like really path leading work. And, you know, what Dustin was just saying, you know, for example, comes from definition that I think UNTL wrote, the definition of ableism. And I think once you understand how ableism is rooted in anti-Blackness, you kind of can't unsee that. And I would just add to that, like other forms of racism, sometimes seep in as well, in terms of, you know, I live in Chicago in a neighborhood that's right now, you know, historically has been majority Asian, right now maybe 50% Asian. And there's been so many examples of anti-Asian violence attacks that have happened, you know, even around where I live. And a lot of them have been on elderly people, people who are walking with a cane, people who look, you know, kind of quote unquote more vulnerable. And I don't think that that is not about ableism. I don't think that's something that we should not get involved in. I think that it's absolutely related to that. And so I think that the kind of anti-normative, pathologizing, you know, roots, eugenic roots of ableism are incredibly rooted in white supremacy and other forms of racism and colonialism as well. And I think a lot of us who do the work of disability justice, it's hard to like untie that. Like it's absolutely interconnected to each other. And if anybody has any, you know, quips with that or doesn't understand it, just watch the trial now, you know, the George Floyd trial. I mean, just look around. I mean, it's really everywhere. And I don't want to end on like that note, right? Like the note of like how awful, but this is really a call for action. It's not a note of how awful. That if you are a person that wants to get involved, ableism is that too. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Thank you on behalf of Dr. Asishi and I and the center for joining us today. If you notice in the chat, I put a link. If you are a student seeking verification of your attendance, you can click on the link. If you're a rehabilitation counselor seeking continuing education credits, I have a link in there as well. And hope everyone like myself is going to be downloading the chat, so all of the wonderful resources that have been shared throughout can be captured and read later to really bring to fruition what we've learned today. So thank you very much for joining us, and a heartfelt thank you to all of our speakers today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This was wonderful.
All right, Veronica, is there anything else we need to do for today?
Yeah, I feel like,
No,